Sometimes the biggest mistake a man can make is choosing the wrong quiet person to disrespect. The Redstone State Prison cafeteria was loud the way prison cafeterias always were, metal trays sliding across steel counters, chairs scraping against the concrete floor, voices echoing beneath buzzing fluorescent lights that had probably been hanging there since the late 1980s. The smell of overcooked eggs, burnt toast, and cheap coffee filled the air, the kind of smell every inmate eventually stopped noticing. But that afternoon, something unusual was about to cut through the noise like a sudden change in weather. At the far end of the serving line, a man stepped forward with his tray, moving slowly, calmly, like he had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. His name was Marcus Carter. 42 years old, 6 feet tall, broad shoulders hidden under the loose orange uniform the state issued to every inmate who walked through the gates. Nothing about him looked extraordinary. His hair was cut short. His face carried the quiet lines of someone who had spent a long time learning patience. He didn't look nervous the way most new inmates did during their first week. He didn't look angry either. He just looked observant. Marcus took his tray and scanned the cafeteria the way a traveler might study a crowded airport terminal, calm eyes taking in exits, corners, and the small details most people ignored. Across the room sat the table everyone in the block knew about. 5 men. Loud voices. Easy laughter that wasn't friendly. In Redstone, that table belonged to Dylan Reeves and the small group that followed him everywhere. Dylan was the kind of man people noticed immediately. 6'3", heavy frame, pale skin marked with faded tattoos that told pieces of a long prison story. For years he had built a reputation in this block without needing to raise his voice very often. The rules around him were simple. New inmates paid respect. Sometimes that meant giving up part of their food. Sometimes it meant sitting somewhere else. Most people understood the system quickly. Marcus Carter didn't seem interested in the system at all. He found an empty seat near the wall and sat down quietly, placing his tray in front of him like it was just another lunch in just another building somewhere in America. That small choice didn't go unnoticed. Dylan leaned back in his chair, watching the new inmate the way a bored man might watch something mildly interesting on television. One of the men beside him laughed under his breath. Another nudged Dylan with his elbow. Within seconds the entire table was looking at Marcus. The cafeteria noise kept rolling around them, but the air near that corner of the room felt different. Dylan stood up slowly, picked up his own tray, and walked toward Marcus with the relaxed confidence of someone who had done this same walk 100 times before. A few nearby inmates lowered their voices. A few others looked away. Marcus kept his eyes on his food, calm and steady. Dylan stopped beside the table and leaned forward just enough to make his presence impossible to ignore. Without saying a word, he looked down at Marcus's tray, smirked slightly, and let out a short laugh. Then he did something that made a couple of nearby inmates freeze in place. Dylan spat directly onto the center of Marcus Carter's meal. A ripple of laughter spread from Dylan's table across the cafeteria like someone had just told a crude joke. Dylan straightened up, clearly expecting the usual reaction, anger, embarrassment, maybe fear. Instead, Marcus Carter slowly looked down at the tray, studying it for a moment with the same calm expression he had worn since walking into the room. Around them, people waited. Because something about the way Marcus Carter moved, the way he didn't rush, didn't argue, didn't even look surprised, made the entire moment feel unfinished. And no one in that cafeteria realized yet that the quiet man sitting at that table had once spent years in one of the most demanding military units in the world. To Dylan Reeves, Marcus Carter looked like just another inmate who had picked the wrong seat at the wrong time. But sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one who has already seen far worse places than prison. The laughter did not stop right away. It rolled across the cafeteria in small waves, the way noise moves through a crowded stadium when something embarrassing happens on the field. Dylan Reeves remained standing beside the table, his grin wide and confident, clearly satisfied with the reaction he had created. Around him, several inmates leaned back in their chairs to watch what they assumed would be another predictable moment in The daily routine of Redstone State Prison. New inmate sits down. New inmate learns the rules. That was how things normally worked inside these concrete walls. Marcus Carter did not move immediately. He kept his eyes on the tray for another second, studying the food as if he were deciding whether it was still worth eating. Then he slowly pushed the tray a few inches away from himself. The motion was calm, deliberate, almost casual. No anger. No complaint. No sudden reaction that would entertain the men around him. That calm response caused a few nearby inmates to exchange glances. One man near the corner of the room muttered something under his breath to the person sitting beside him. Another inmate quietly shook his head as if he had just noticed something the others had missed. Dylan tilted his head slightly, watching Marcus more carefully now. Most men reacted immediately when their pride was challenged in front of a crowd. They shouted. They stood up quickly. They tried to prove they were not weak. Marcus Carter did none of those things. He simply wiped his hands slowly with a napkin, folded the napkin once, and placed it beside the tray. The quietness of that movement seemed to stretch the moment longer than anyone expected. For a second, the laughter began to fade, replaced by a strange curiosity that moved through the room. Dylan rested one hand on the edge of the table and leaned forward again, lowering his voice just enough that the men closest to them could hear clearly. He spoke in the slow confident tone of someone who had spent years reminding people who was in charge. The question he asked was simple. Was there a problem? Marcus finally looked up. His eyes were steady, not challenging, not afraid, simply focused on the man standing in front of him. For a brief moment the two men held that eye contact. It was the kind of quiet pause that sometimes appears before a storm, when the air feels still but charged with something that has not happened yet. Marcus answered in a calm voice that carried just far enough for the nearby tables to hear. He said that there was no problem at all. Dylan gave a short laugh again, louder this time, as if Marcus had just confirmed exactly what he expected. One of Dylan's friends slapped the table and made another joke, drawing another round of scattered laughter from a few people across the room. But the reaction was different now. The laughter sounded thinner, less confident. A few of the older inmates continued watching Marcus Carter with a more careful expression. They had seen enough years inside different prisons to recognize certain small details that younger inmates ignored. The way Marcus sat with his back close to the wall. The way his shoulders remained relaxed instead of tense. The way his eyes moved briefly across the room, measuring distances without turning his head very much. One man at the far end of the cafeteria whispered quietly to the person next to him that the new guy moved like someone who had spent time in the military. His friend shrugged, unconvinced, but kept watching anyway. Dylan noticed the shifting attention and straightened up slightly, his smile tightening just a little. Moments like this usually ended quickly, with the new inmate accepting the humiliation and the room returning to its normal noise. But Marcus Carter had not responded the way Dylan expected. And in a place where reputation meant everything, unpredictability was something Dylan Reeves did not enjoy. For a few seconds no one moved. The cafeteria noise slowly returned, but the tension around Marcus Carter's table lingered like the quiet after a loud thunderclap. Dylan Reeves studied him again, trying to understand what felt different about this new inmate. Most men inside Redstone State Prison had already learned the invisible rules before their first week ended. The strong set the tone. The rest adjusted or paid the price. It was a system that had grown slowly over years, shaped by boredom, reputation, and the silent agreements that existed between inmates and guards who preferred order over constant problems. Dylan had built his place in that system carefully. He did not need to shout often because most people already knew how things worked around him. But Marcus Carter did not seem interested in those rules. Marcus picked up the napkin again and wiped a small spot of food from the edge of the table. The motion was unhurried, the kind of simple movement someone might make in a quiet diner along a highway somewhere in the Midwest. A few feet away, Dylan's friends watched with growing confusion. One of them leaned forward and whispered something in Dylan's ear, expecting The moment to escalate the way these situations normally did. Dylan gave a short shrug as if to say he still had control of the situation. Yet something about Marcus Carter's stillness made the air feel different. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly. Metal trays clattered in the distance. Somewhere near the back of the cafeteria a guard walked past the doorway, barely glancing inside the room the way guards often did when nothing obvious seemed wrong. Marcus sat quietly for another moment before standing up from the table. He lifted the tray carefully, walked to the nearby trash bin, and emptied the food without a word. The action looked almost polite, as if he were simply finished with lunch. Then he placed the empty tray on the return rack and stepped back into the open space of the cafeteria. Several inmates nearby followed his movement with their eyes. One older man with gray hair and weathered hands watched Marcus with a thoughtful expression, the way someone studies a puzzle that has not revealed its answer yet. Dylan crossed his arms and let out another small laugh, but the sound carried less confidence than before. He spoke loud enough for several tables to hear, asking Marcus if he had forgotten something important. The question hung in the air. Marcus turned slightly and faced Dylan again. His expression remained calm, almost patient, like someone listening to a child complain about something trivial. When Marcus answered, his voice stayed steady and relaxed. He said he had not forgotten anything at all. Dylan tilted his head, studying him more closely now. Up close he noticed details he had ignored earlier. Marcus stood straight but not stiff. His breathing was slow and even. His eyes moved across the room occasionally, not nervously, but carefully, like someone mapping the space around him without needing to turn his whole body. One of the older inmates near the wall quietly whispered to the man beside him that the new guy carried himself like a professional soldier. His friend raised an eyebrow but did not argue. Inside prison, experience taught people to trust small instincts. Dylan finally stepped back half a pace, still smiling but no longer laughing. Something about Marcus Carter felt different, and in a place like Redstone, different could mean trouble. The rest of the cafeteria slowly returned to its usual rhythm of conversation and noise, but many eyes continued to follow the quiet man standing near the tray rack. No one realized yet that this small moment in an ordinary prison lunchroom had just changed the way several people in that room would look at Marcus Carter from that day forward. Marcus Carter walked away from the tray rack without rushing, his step steady against the worn concrete floor as the sounds of the cafeteria slowly swallowed the moment that had just happened. Around him the room returned to its normal rhythm. Forks scraped against plastic trays. Conversations restarted in low voices. Someone laughed too loudly near the vending machines. On the surface it looked like the usual afternoon inside Redstone State Prison. But several men kept watching Marcus as he crossed the room. In places like this, people learned to notice the quiet details that others ignored. Marcus moved with an unusual kind of balance. His shoulders stayed relaxed. His head turned slightly at each corner without making the motion obvious. It was the way someone walked when they were used to paying attention to every exit in a room. At a table near the far wall sat Luis Ortega, a thin man in his mid-30s who had been inside Redstone long enough to understand how the cafeteria worked. Luis lowered his voice and leaned closer to the older inmate sitting beside him. He said that the new guy did not move like someone who had just arrived in prison. The older inmate followed Marcus with his eyes and slowly nodded. Experience inside prison taught men that posture could reveal more than words. Most new inmates carried tension in their shoulders. They walked stiffly or too quickly. Marcus Carter looked like someone who had already spent years in controlled environments where awareness mattered. Dylan Reeves remained standing near the table where everything had started. His friends were talking again, making jokes about the situation, but Dylan was no longer laughing. His eyes followed Marcus with a more thoughtful expression. Dylan had spent nearly a decade building his reputation in Redstone. Reputation meant survival in a place like this. If people began questioning his authority, even quietly, that could spread faster than any rumor. One of Dylan's friends asked him if they were going to let the situation go. Dylan waved a hand dismissively as if the question was not worth answering. But inside his mind something was shifting. The new inmate had not reacted the way people normally did. There had been no anger. No argument. No attempt to impress anyone. That kind of calm could mean many things. And in prison, uncertainty was something Dylan preferred to eliminate quickly. Marcus reached the far side of the cafeteria and stopped briefly near the water fountain. He filled a paper cup, took a slow drink, and set the empty cup in the trash bin. Then he turned toward the hallway that led back to the housing blocks. 2 correctional officers stood near the doorway talking quietly about their shift schedule. They barely looked up as Marcus passed between them. For them it was just another inmate leaving lunch. Nothing unusual. Yet several pairs of eyes in the cafeteria followed him until he disappeared into the corridor. Luis Ortega leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He had seen hundreds of small confrontations inside prison dining halls, but something about that moment felt unfinished. He whispered to the older inmate beside him that the quiet ones were usually the ones who surprised people later. The older inmate nodded again and kept his gaze on the hallway where Marcus had disappeared. Back at the table near the center of the room, Dylan Reeves finally sat down. His smile returned for a moment as he spoke loudly enough for his group to hear, making another joke about the new guy walking away from lunch. His friends laughed again, but the sound carried a trace of hesitation. Because somewhere in the back of their minds a small question had begun to form. And in a place like Redstone State Prison, small questions had a way of growing into much larger problems. Marcus Carter walked down the narrow corridor that connected the cafeteria to Housing Block D, the sound of heavy steel doors echoing faintly somewhere deeper inside the prison. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and old concrete, the kind of scent that seemed permanently soaked into the walls after decades of use. A few inmates moved through the corridor ahead of him, talking quietly as they returned to their cells after lunch. Marcus walked at the same steady pace he had kept since entering the building earlier that day. Nothing about his posture suggested urgency. Nothing suggested anger either. Yet his eyes quietly tracked the details. Around him. The position of the security camera above the corner. The distance between the guard station and the stairwell. The rhythm of footsteps behind him. Inside Redstone State Prison, those kinds of details mattered more than most people realized. Back in the cafeteria, Dylan Reeves leaned forward with both elbows on the table, staring at the spot where Marcus had been sitting only minutes earlier. The laughter around him had started to fade as the room slowly emptied. His friends continued talking, but their conversation had shifted into something more curious than amused. One of them asked why the new inmate had not reacted the way everyone expected. Dylan shrugged again, pretending the answer was obvious. He said the guy probably understood the situation and decided it was smarter to stay quiet. That explanation sounded good enough on the surface. But the truth was Dylan had seen something in Marcus Carter's eyes during that short moment of eye contact. It had not been fear. It had not been anger either. It had been something calmer, something harder to read. And that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. At a nearby table, Luis Ortega finished the last of his coffee and stood up slowly. He had watched the entire scene carefully from beginning to end. When he walked past Dylan's table on his way out of the cafeteria, he glanced briefly in Dylan's direction. The look lasted only a second, but it carried the quiet awareness of someone who understood how prison reputations could shift. Dylan noticed the glance and frowned slightly, clearly aware that other inmates had been paying attention to what had happened. Reputation inside prison was not built on one moment alone. It was built on how people talked about those moments afterward. Meanwhile, Marcus Carter stepped through the final security gate and entered the housing block. The large room beyond the gate opened into 2 long rows of metal cells stacked on 2 levels. The sound inside the block was different from the cafeteria. Televisions played quietly in the common area. A few men sat at tables playing cards. Others leaned against the railings on the upper tier, watching the movement below with bored expressions. Marcus paused briefly just inside the entrance, allowing his eyes to adjust to the lighting while quietly taking in the layout of the block. The open stairwell to the second level stood on the left side of the room. The guard station sat behind reinforced glass near the center. A narrow walkway ran along the edge of the cells like a metal balcony. These were the kinds of details Marcus absorbed automatically without needing to think about them. One of the inmates near the card table noticed him standing there and nudged the man beside him. The quiet newcomer from the cafeteria had just arrived in the block. Within minutes several people would hear about what had happened during lunch. In places like Redstone, information traveled quickly. And while Marcus Carter walked calmly toward the staircase that led to his assigned cell, the story of a quiet inmate who had refused to react was already beginning to circulate through the building. Marcus Carter climbed the metal staircase toward the second tier of housing Block D with the same quiet rhythm he had kept since arriving in the prison. The steps rang softly under his boots, the hollow steel echo traveling through the open space of the block. A few inmates leaned over the railing above, watching him without saying anything. New arrivals were always noticed. But Marcus did not look up at them. His attention stayed on the path ahead, steady and calm, the way someone walks through a place they intend to understand rather than challenge. When he reached the top level he turned left and moved along the narrow walkway that ran in front of the upper row of cells. The metal railing on his right overlooked the common area below where several men still sat at the card tables. The televisions continued playing in the background, filling the block with the low murmur of daytime talk shows and sports commentary. Marcus reached the cell marked with his number and paused for a moment before stepping inside. The cell was small, just wide enough for 2 bunks, a stainless steel sink, and a narrow toilet mounted against the back wall. The concrete floor showed years of wear. Someone had scratched initials into the metal frame of the lower bunk long before Marcus arrived. His assigned bunk was the upper one. Marcus placed his folded blanket on the thin mattress and sat down slowly. From this position he could see through the bars into most of the housing block. It was a habit that had developed over years in environments where observation was more valuable than conversation. Below him, the afternoon routine continued. Inmates walked between tables. A guard inside the glass station wrote something in a logbook. Someone shouted a joke from across the room and a few people laughed. But even as the normal rhythm of the block returned, small pieces of information were already moving from one inmate to another. A man who had been in the cafeteria began describing the situation to the group at the card table. He explained how the new inmate had stayed calm when Dylan Reeves tried to embarrass him. Another inmate leaned back in his chair and asked if the guy had argued or tried to fight. The first man shook his head and said the opposite had happened. The new guy had simply walked away like the moment did not matter. That detail caught the attention of several men sitting nearby. Inside prison, calm could mean confidence. Confidence could mean experience. And experience could mean someone who understood situations far better than they appeared on the surface. Luis Ortega entered the block a few minutes later and stopped near the bottom of the staircase. He glanced toward the second tier and spotted Marcus sitting quietly on the upper bunk of his cell. Luis studied him for a moment. The new inmate was not reading. He was not pacing. He was simply sitting there, elbows resting loosely on his knees, eyes moving slowly across the room as if he were learning the entire layout of the building piece by piece. Luis had spent enough time inside Redstone to recognize that kind of behavior. It was the way professionals studied unfamiliar territory. Down at the card table someone mentioned Dylan Reeves again. A few men exchanged looks. Dylan's reputation had controlled the block for a long time, but reputation depended on perception. And perception could begin to shift the moment people started asking questions. Up on the second tier Marcus Carter remained silent, listening to the distant sounds of conversation drifting upward through the open air of the housing block. From the outside it looked like a man simply resting after lunch. But anyone who understood quiet discipline would have recognized something else entirely. Marcus Carter was not resting. He was observing. And the more he observed, the more the invisible patterns of Redstone State Prison began to reveal themselves. The afternoon. Light filtered through the narrow reinforced windows high above Housing Block D, casting pale rectangles across the concrete walls as the routine of the prison slowly settled into its quieter rhythm. Marcus Carter remained seated on the upper bunk of his cell, elbows resting lightly on his knees, his posture relaxed but alert. From where he sat he could see most of the common area below. A group of inmates continued their card game near the center tables. One man paced slowly near the stairwell while speaking into the wall-mounted phone. Another leaned against the railing of the opposite tier watching a muted television broadcast. None of it looked unusual. Yet to someone trained to read environments, the room revealed far more than casual movement. Every block had its own invisible structure. Some men commanded attention without speaking. Others stayed quiet because they understood exactly where they stood in the order of things. Marcus watched the patterns patiently, the way someone studies the tide before stepping into the water. Down below, Luis Ortega finished his conversation at the card table and glanced again toward the second tier. The quiet newcomer had not moved much since arriving in the block. That alone made him interesting. Luis had spent 6 years in different correctional facilities before arriving at Redstone, and he had learned that stillness often meant discipline rather than weakness. One of the men at the table asked Luis whether the new guy had said anything during the cafeteria incident. Luis shook his head and explained that Marcus had barely spoken at all. That answer made the group fall briefly silent. In prison, words were cheap. Self-control was not. On the other side of the block, the heavy door to the corridor opened and Dylan Reeves stepped inside with 2 members of his group walking close behind him. The conversation around the card tables softened almost immediately. Dylan moved with the easy confidence of someone used to being watched. His eyes scanned the room automatically until they reached the second tier. He spotted Marcus sitting in the open doorway of his cell. For a moment Dylan simply stood there, arms folded, studying him. The distance between them stretched across the open space of the housing block like an invisible line drawn between 2 different kinds of calm. Marcus noticed Dylan the same moment Dylan noticed him. Their eyes met. Across the room. Marcus did not look away. But he did not challenge the stare either. His expression remained neutral, almost patient, as if he had seen similar moments play out in many different places before. Several inmates nearby quietly followed the exchange without speaking. Dylan eventually smiled again, but the smile carried less certainty than the one he had worn earlier in the cafeteria. He leaned toward one of his friends and said something that made the man laugh softly. Yet Dylan's gaze returned to Marcus more than once as he crossed the room toward his own cell on the lower tier. Up above, Marcus Carter slowly leaned back against the wall beside his bunk and folded his arms loosely across his chest. The block continued its afternoon routine around him, but the quiet observation between the 2 men had already been noticed by more than a few people. And inside Redstone State Prison, moments like that rarely stayed small for very long. The quiet tension that had formed across Housing Block D did not disappear as the afternoon continued. If anything, it settled deeper into the room like a slow-moving current beneath the surface of ordinary prison life. Marcus Carter remained seated near the entrance of his cell on the upper tier, watching the block with the same calm patience he had carried since arriving at Redstone State Prison. The television noise drifted upward from the common area. A game show audience clapped on the screen while 2 inmates argued quietly about a card hand near the metal tables. From the outside it looked like another routine afternoon behind bars. Yet several men inside the block kept glancing toward the upper tier. Stories traveled quickly inside prison walls, and the story of the quiet newcomer who had refused to react in the cafeteria was already moving from conversation to conversation. Luis Ortega leaned against the railing near the bottom of the staircase, arms folded loosely, observing the block the way experienced inmates often did when they sensed something beginning to shift. He noticed Dylan Reeves sitting at the table near the far corner with his usual group. Dylan was talking, laughing occasionally, but his attention kept drifting toward the upper tier. That small detail did not escape Luis. Reputation inside a prison was not just about strength. It was about control of perception. If people started wondering whether someone new could not be pushed around, that question alone could change how the entire block behaved. A few minutes later Dylan finally stood up from his table. The room did not go silent, but the level of noise softened slightly as several inmates noticed him walking toward the center of the block. His steps were relaxed, confident, the same way he had moved for years inside these walls. Yet this time his path led toward the staircase that climbed to the upper tier. Luis watched carefully without moving. Marcus Carter also saw Dylan approach, but his expression did not change. Marcus simply shifted slightly on the edge of the bunk and rested one hand loosely on the metal frame beside him. Dylan reached the bottom of the staircase and paused for a moment, looking upward. Their eyes met again across the distance. The moment stretched quietly while the block continued its normal rhythm around them. Then Dylan began climbing the steps. The metal staircase rang softly with each step. Several inmates near the railings leaned slightly forward, pretending not to watch while clearly paying attention. Dylan reached the upper walkway and stopped several feet from Marcus's cell. For a moment he simply stood there, studying the quiet inmate more closely than before. Marcus remained seated, calm, almost thoughtful, as if this meeting was something he had expected eventually. Dylan spoke first. His voice carried an easy tone, not aggressive, not friendly, but curious. He said he had been thinking about lunch earlier. He said most men reacted differently when something like that happened. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Dylan finished speaking, Marcus answered in the same steady voice he had used all afternoon. He said that sometimes reacting quickly only makes situations louder than they need to be. The answer caused a few nearby inmates to exchange quick glances. Dylan smiled slowly at the response, but the smile carried a hint of uncertainty now. Because standing only a few feet away from Marcus Carter, he was beginning to realize something that several others in the block had already suspected. The quiet man in the cell was not trying to prove anything to anyone. And in a place like Redstone State Prison, that kind of calm often belonged to someone who already understood exactly who they were. For several seconds neither man spoke again. The upper tier walkway felt strangely quiet. Even though the rest of the housing block continued its normal rhythm below. The television still played in the common area. Cards continued sliding across the metal tables. Somewhere near the phones a man laughed loudly at something his friend had said. But the attention of more than a few inmates had shifted toward the narrow strip of metal floor where Dylan Reeves stood facing Marcus Carter. Dylan rested one hand lightly on the railing beside him and studied Marcus with a thoughtful expression that had replaced the confidence he usually carried. For years inside Redstone State Prison he had been the one asking the questions and watching how other people reacted. That was how you learned who could be pushed and who could not. Most inmates tried to act tough the moment they felt challenged. Others showed fear immediately. Marcus Carter had done neither. Dylan tilted his head slightly and said that most men in this place had something they were trying to prove. Reputation. Pride. Respect. Those things drove nearly every argument that happened inside these walls. Marcus listened quietly and then answered in the same calm tone he had used all afternoon. He said that sometimes the strongest position a man could take was not needing to prove anything at all. The answer hung in the air for a moment. Several inmates along the upper railing glanced at each other without speaking. Dylan's smile returned slowly, but this time it looked more thoughtful than mocking. He nodded once as if acknowledging something he had not expected to hear. Then he stepped back half a pace, resting both hands on the railing while he looked out across the housing block below. From that position he could see nearly everyone in the room. Some men pretended to focus on their cards. Others watched openly. Prison life had taught them to recognize moments when the balance inside a block might shift, even slightly. Dylan finally looked back at Marcus and said that Redstone had its own way of doing things. People here usually figured that out quickly. Marcus nodded once, showing he understood the statement without arguing with it. He said that every place had its own rhythm, and it usually became clear if a man took the time to observe before reacting. That response earned a small chuckle from Dylan. For the first time since climbing the staircase he looked almost relaxed. After another brief pause he pushed himself away from the railing and stepped back toward the stairs. Before leaving the upper tier he glanced once more toward Marcus and said quietly that the block would be watching the new guy for a while. Marcus answered simply that observation worked both ways. Dylan laughed under his breath at that comment and began walking down the staircase. The metal steps echoed softly as he returned to the lower level. Around the block the tension that had quietly gathered during the conversation slowly began to dissolve into the ordinary sounds of prison life again. Luis Ortega leaned back against the railing near the card tables and exhaled slowly, realizing the moment had passed without the explosion many people expected. Yet the conversation had changed something invisible inside the room. Word would spread quickly that Dylan Reeves had walked away from the encounter without forcing the issue. And word would also spread about the quiet inmate on the upper tier who had remained calm through every second of it. Marcus Carter sat back on the edge of his bunk once more and looked out across the block as the afternoon light faded slowly through the high windows. To anyone glancing up from below he looked like just another inmate resting after lunch. But to those who paid close attention, it was clear that the quiet man in cell D17 had already become someone people were beginning to think about very carefully.